Hello everyone. Welcome to Novel Story in English. I will present the story of a love story, forced marriage. Plague. One slap landed on Brian's cheek, and the slap was strong enough to see a red liquid at the corner of his lips. Brian held his cheek, which had just been slapped by Pasha. Brian did not think that he would get the first slap from Pasha, his own father. Truly, this is the first time that Brian has been treated harshly by Pasha. As long as he was born and raised until he grew this big, he had never felt the pain of Pasha's hands. Brian was silent, and he looked down. Brian hated Anggia even more because this all happened because of Anggia. Pasha learned of the news of the death of Anggia's parents, and he went straight to his Basan's residence. But what he found was that Anggia was crying hysterically without Brian by her side, and after the funeral was over, Pasha left without even saying goodbye to Anggia. Because Pasha saw Anggia's blank stare, he just sat quietly in his parents' room, hugging his knees. And now Abraham is in Brian's apartment. Abraham, who knows the password to Brian's apartment, doesn't have to bother knocking first. With the emotion he carried, he continued to walk in, and his eyes sharpened when he saw Brian was sleeping soundly with a woman beside him. Pasha was no longer able to contain her emotions. Anggia was crying without having anyone besides her. And his parents were just buried this morning, so what? Brian didn't even care one bit about Anggia's grief. Pasha continued to walk towards Brian, who was fast asleep hugging his lover. Krangug. Pasha threw an urn that was in the corner of Brian's room, and he threw it right at the wall. The sound of shards sounded so loud that Brian and Bella woke up in shock. Both reflexively sat on the bed, but Brian was more shocked when he saw Pasha standing in front of him. If you really can't accept Anggia, it's okay, I won't force you anymore, I'll give you the company, and you're free to do anything. But remember, don't you ever call me Dad again. Pasha said very firmly to Brian. I really don't love her. I will never love Anggia, but why does Dad only think of me as a child if I stay with him? Brian asked. Pasha was silent. He was still looking at Brian, and now he started to look at the woman who was standing next to Brian. Pasha smiled sarcastically and cursed his own son's stupidity. You don't want to accept Anggia as your wife? Asked Pasha while continuing to stare at the sexy woman who was in between them. Meanwhile, Bella smiled. She misinterpreted Pasha's gaze. Bella thinks Pasha is also interested in trying her sexy body because Pasha smiled at him, and without him understanding that Pasha was disgusted with that woman. Yes, Brian said without hesitation. Proc proc proc. Pasha smiled while clapping his hands at Brian's funny answer. Meanwhile, Bella thinks that Pasha will also approve of her relationship with Brian, or that he will be made Pasha's bedmate. It doesn't matter even if it's the father, Bella thought. I didn't think you were this stupid, Brian, Pasha said with a chuckle. What do you mean, Dad? Asked Brian, who didn't understand what Pasha meant. You're really stupid. You know, Brian, gold is indeed yellow. But yellow isn't necessarily gold. You throw gold for trash like this woman, said Pasha as he pointed his left hand at Bella. Ahaha. How much money did I spend on your school? But this is the knowledge you get. I really didn't expect, Brian, said Pasha again. Why did Uncle say I'm trash? She asked. Pasha raised an eyebrow, and he didn't expect Bella to dare to ask him. Maybe if this woman still had shame, she would have chosen to leave rather than stay there. Then what should I say? Asked Pasha sarcastically. I have pride, Uncle, and Uncle don't insult me. Bella half shouted. Aha ha aha. Is there a woman who has self-respect like you? Asked Pasha. Uncle said this because Uncle has not felt it with me, said Bella with a smile, hoping Pasha seduced him. What an immoral woman. You hear, Brian? What kind of woman is she? Said Pasha. Bella, out. Brian's orders. But. Go out. Pasha snapped. Do you not want to improve your relationship with Anggia? Asked Pasha. No, Brian answered firmly. Pasha was silent. He was thinking about something. After a long silence and considering several decisions he would take, now he looked at Brian's face, who was also looking at him. Okay. You can divorce Anggia, and you don't have to worry. I will give the company to you, Pasha said firmly. Brian smiled. That's what he expected. Yes, and I'll be working on my divorce soon, Brian said happily. Please. And after that, you don't use Wairatuan's last name anymore. And assume we never have blood ties, then you don't need to call me father anymore. I don't want to, said Pasha very firmly. Brian felt Pasha's words hurt more than the slap Pasha gave him. But I'm Daddy's son, Brian said. I don't want to be your father anymore, replied Pasha. Dad, why are you defending the prostitute? I know that she left early in the morning and came back the next morning among men. Is that woman whom you consider a good woman? Brian asked sarcastically. Plague. Pasha's hand flew to Brian's cheek again roughly. Watch your words, said Pasha in a deep voice. Pasha did not understand how Brian thought that he had the heart to insult Anggia. But it's true, said Brian. Don't you ever regret your words, don't let you lick the saliva you've thrown away, said Pasha, then he walked away, leaving Brian. Damn, woman, I'm going to teach you a lesson. I'm going to make you beg for forgiveness from me, and this is an insult, Brian muttered. Brian clenched his fists, and it wasn't long before Pasha left. The door began to open, and it was Anggia. Anggia didn't care about Brian, who was staring at him sharply. He again intends to just take some of his belongings. After that, he will leave and will not come back to Brian. Why did you come back here? Brian said. Anggia did not care about Brian's words, and she continued to walk to her room and tidy up all her things. That's what Anggia thought, but it seemed that things weren't that easy because Brian angrily continued to approach Anggia, who was putting his clothes in the suitcase. Hey bitch, are you deaf? Brian said as he pulled Anggia's arm. Anggia brushed off Brian's hand and then glared at Brian. There was no longer a wife's respect for her husband. There was no longer the shyness and courtesy that he had always shown to Brian. There was only hatred that had been embedded in his heart. And all because of the way Brian had treated him so far. Enough of you insulting me. If a woman like me is a whore, then what are you? Asked Anggia with her eyes fixed on Brian. Brian was silent, and this was the first time Anggia denied and answered his words harshly. Of course, Brian did not accept it all. Don't be so rude to me, snapped Brian. Who are you that I should be polite to you? Asked Anggia, not wanting to lose. I'm your husband, said Brian firmly. Husband, said Anggia with a cynical smile and looked down on Brian. Have so many men fucked you? That you've forgotten who your husband is, said Brian mocking Anggia. Yeah. You're right, and you know? I've even felt a lot of men because I never got all of that from my husband, lied Anggia. Yes, you are right, and you are never wrong. Therefore I want to end this household. I no longer want to be your wife, a man who has no heart and feelings, said Anggia by shouting. Brian pushed Anggia's body, Anggia fell on the floor, Brian squatted down, and his hands began to grip Anggia's chin, getting stronger and maybe already red on Anggia's white skin. "Now you have the courage to answer my words," said Brian, strengthening his grip. "And I'm sorry I've been silent all this time," Anggia answered with tears already running down her cheeks. "You," Brian said, pulling Anggia's body back to its feet. "Tisk." Anggia chuckled as she let go of Brian's hand on her. Anggia was tired of giving in, and she didn't have the slightest bit of patience left for Brian. "Don't be rude to me. Isn't it enough that you've hurt me? If you don't want to marry a maid's daughter, you just divorce me." "I've never forced you to stay with me," Anggia answered. Anggia resumed what he had been doing. He continued to put his belongings in until they ran out and he was about to pull his suitcase out. But unfortunately, Brian held back again. "Where are you going?" said Brian, standing in front of the door to prevent Anggia from coming out. "Get out of the way," said Anggia, pushing Brian's body, but his strength was not strong enough. Brian didn't even move a bit. "If you want to leave here, please, but you can't bring anything. Because everything you wear, including your proud white coat, is all because of my father. And my means mine. You have no right," said Brian firmly. "Oh yes, I'm confused why someone as good as your father can have a child like you," Anggia answered. "You are alive and successful because of my father's money. Remember that." Anggia nodded in understanding. She opened her suitcase and then took her hand to the white coat she usually wears. Anggia put it on the bed, but it didn't stop there. Anggia took her medical certificate, then Anggia put it on Brian's chest. "Take." Anggia snapped because Brian was just silent. Anggia put it all on the bed. "I will not be a doctor anymore. Until I pay my debt to you," said Anggia, his hand pointed at Brian's face, who was standing in front of him. "How arrogant," Brian sneered. Because Brian was sure it was just Anggia's bluff, according to Brian, Anggia wouldn't be able to do anything but a bluff. Anggia also opened her handbag, then took an ATM card, which Brian had given her to buy kitchen necessities. Anggia never even bought a personal item for herself with the card. "Here," Anggia threw the card right into Brian's face. Brian was shocked and couldn't believe what Anggia was doing. "Get out of the way," Anggia pushed Brian's body. Brian's body shifted because he was still in his thoughts. Anggia continued to walk out of the room. Brian also walked behind Anggia. His hand pulled Anggia's arm. Anggia stopped and turned back. Both of them looked at each other sharply. "Especially if you get out of here, then never come back again," said Brian. Anggia smiled sarcastically. For him, Brian could no longer threaten her. "I don't care," Anggia snapped, continuing her steps to leave Brian without bringing anything. All he had in his hands was his favorite little bag. Anggia kept walking until she got into the elevator. Her tears continued to flow, not because she was sad to leave Brian, but her heart was sad because she couldn't become a doctor until she made up for all the money she had spent on her father in college. Ting! Anggia got out of the elevator, and now she had arrived at the lobby. Anggia stopped, then her eyes looked around. Who knows what she saw? After that, she walked back out of the building. Anggia is standing on the side of the road, waiting for a taxi. She wants to go to her friend Veli's house. Anggia takes the cell phone that is in her bag and looks for Veli's contact. "Hello, Vel?" asked Angie. "What's wrong, Angie?" asked Veli on the other side. "I'm at your house," said Anggia. "I'm out of town, Anggia. My cousin is getting married, and I'm coming home tomorrow," said Veli. "Yes, I'll just go to your place tomorrow," said Anggia. Anggia, are you no longer in trouble? I'm going home now. I know you must be sad, said Veli, who was worried. No. You don't go home, I don't mind, we'll meet tomorrow, answered Anggia, who didn't want to bother Veli. Okay. Tomorrow I come home, and you have to tell me, said Veli. Yeah, see you tomorrow. Beep. Anggia turned off her phone. Anggia looked down, and her tears were still flowing until Anggia gasped when a BMW car stopped in front of her. Bilmar opened his car window and saw Anggia. Come in, said Bilmar. Anggia wiped her tears roughly and tried to neutralize herself. Sorry, sir, but I'm not in need of a ride, said Anggia gently. Bilmar got out of the car. He walked over to Anggia. Bilmar opened the car door and pulled Anggia slowly to get into his car. Sir, why did you force me in? Asked Anggia, confused. Enter, said Bilmar with a straight face. Anggia was silent, and he went in. After all, he didn't know where to go, and he really wanted to find a boarding house for him to live in. Bilmar also came in and started driving his car at a moderate speed. Where are you going? Asked Bilmar, occasionally glancing at Anggia beside him. I also don't know, sir, if you can just get off at the front, Anggia answered while clutching the bag in his hand. Bilmar realized that, and he was sure Anggia was in trouble.